Good morning. It's 24.5 minutes until 2 a.m. Ted Kenworthy has a couple of nights off. I'm Charlie Dugdale with you tonight and tomorrow night. This is the late news on Channel 2. The Western world, led by State Secretary Henry Kissinger, may be ready to go nose to nose with the Arab oil-producing nations in a confrontation over the price and availability of the fuel that runs the world. John Lawrence has a report from Paris.
French President Giscard d'Estaing warned that the delegates would be working in the face of possible confrontation and selfishness at the three-day conference. Kissinger called for lower oil prices and appealed to the oil-rich nations to use more of their profits to aid their poor relations of the Third World. He outlined the important points of his address.
The basic theme of the speech was a pledge of cooperation by the United States and an appeal to cooperation by other nations.
And if the other nations are not forthcoming with that cooperation,
one nation cannot cooperate by itself, but I'm hopeful that this conference will succeed so we can face that problem if it should unexpectedly arise.
How do you think the producers will respond to their request that they make a greater contribution to the world economy?
How can they resist me?
Will you be making...
Kissinger met with a number of other delegates privately to sound out their responses. Sheikh Yamani, the Saudi Arabian oil minister, was one. The reaction of the oil-producing countries to Kissinger's appeal may determine the success or failure of this conference. John Lawrence, CBS News, Paris.
The White House is issuing a stream of denials that it knows anything about United States operations in the new and sorely troubled African nation of Angola. But despite these denials, the Senate Foreign Relations Subcommittee voted to end secret military aid to Angola. Leslie Stahl has a background story on the Angola situation.
United States interest in Angola is nothing new. As early as 1960, the CIA was giving small amounts of aid to this man, Holden Roberto, who headed up the National Front, a guerrilla group fighting the Portuguese for independence. At the same time, the Soviets were sending aid to another guerrilla faction. Then as now, the two powers were interested in a mineral-rich ally with deep water ports on the strategic shipping lanes between Asia and Europe. Over the years, though, Washington and Kremlin support faded, while the Chinese began moving in. Then in 1974, Soviet interest revived. Western specialists believe mainly to counter China's involvement. Then, in reaction to the Soviets, officials say, the Ford administration last spring authorized the CIA to continue covert aid to Roberto and to supply military arms to a third faction called UNITA. Its leader, Jonas Savimbi, had been supported by China, but Chinese aid has been reduced. Meanwhile, Soviet arms shipments to its faction, headed by Agostino Neto, increased. And so in July, the Ford administration decided to ship millions of dollars worth of military aid secretly to its two guerrilla groups. Then last month, in the days just before Angolan independence from Portugal, intelligence sources say Soviet arms began pouring into Luanda and some 4,000 Cuban soldiers arrived. Washington called the Soviet buildup an attempt to upset the East-West balance of power in Africa.
It is fair to assume that they mean to colonize Africa and manifest that they are already partially successful.
There's very great danger in this kind of situation because right now it looks as though even if we put additional weapons in, we may lose. Now, what good has this done? I mean, if we're faced with the prospect of losing, are we going to escalate further? And we get ourselves always in this same trap. I don't think it's worth it. And quite frankly, I think it's a very dangerous game to play.
The hitch in U.S. policy is that Washington is backing the same factions that are getting aid from the Republic of South Africa. Critics of American policy say the U.S. could end up with few allies among the black African countries, since for the majority of the Organization of African Unity, the presence of Soviets and Cubans in Angola is far less concern than that of South Africa.
The presence of South Africa in Angola has no doubt worsened the situation, and unfortunately, because of their presence, a number of countries all over the world have started siding with, taking sides in Angola as a result of the presence of such countries as South Africa.
But South Africa justifies intervention because of the Soviets' presence.
They must have decided that you want Big Town so badly that they can do just what they want. And I want to say this in seriousness. You can forget about South and Big Town should they succeed in Angola.
There's no U.S. involvement in Angola. We have been furnishing some weapons and supplies there to help the people who are friendly to freedom and to the United States. If I were President of the United States, I would say to the Soviets, if you really want to taunt, now is a good place to show it. In other words, if they mean what they say, to live in peace, then let them stay out of the internal affairs of other countries and quit trying to take over other countries.
It's almost over in the Sarah Jane Moore case, and there's a widespread and frightening pollutant in the air to be controlled. These stories and more after a break. Again, the news. Federal Judge Samuel Conte Tuesday urged Sarah Jane Moore to disclose any involvement with another person in her plans to assassinate President Ford in San Francisco last September. Richard Threlkeld has a report from San Francisco.
Today was Sarah Jane Moore's day on the witness stand to testify not in her own defense but to her guilt. She wanted to plead guilty and the court was deciding whether to let her. In a cracked voice, Miss Moore explained how she took a revolver from her purse and fired one shot at President Ford when he emerged from a downtown hotel September 22nd. Yes, she said she had planned to murder the president. Federal Judge Samuel Conte wanted to know whether she was acting alone or whether anyone had counseled her at any time about assassinating the president. Miss Moore paused at first, then finally refused to answer. But later, spokesman for U.S. Attorney James Browning said authorities have no evidence of a conspiracy and still believe Miss Moore was acting on her own. The prosecution called a series of witnesses, local police and federal agents, who witnessed or investigated the incident, all of whom identified Miss Moore as the woman with the gun. And there was a news film rerun of the crime, screened in open court, scenes similar to these. Miss Moore watched the film, then gasped and looked away. Late today, Judge Conte read the final reports from psychiatrists who described Miss Moore as, quote, an emotionally disturbed person who nonetheless understood her actions that day, then accepted her guilty plea and set January 15th for her sentencing. She could be sentenced to life in prison. Richard Threlkeld, CBS News, San Francisco.
Dozens of industrial plants all across the nation were directly affected Tuesday by new EPA regulations aimed at nearly eliminating vinyl chloride from the air surrounding those plants. The agency's chief, Russell Train, says there have been up to 20 cancer deaths linked directly to the inhalation of vinyl chloride. Jed Duvall has a report.
The proposed rules would affect emissions into the air around 58 production plants in all regions of the country. The agency hope is for a 98% reduction of cancer-causing emissions, but EPA Administrator Russell Train admits there is no way to know if that's enough.
There may be no safe level of exposure to any cancer-causing substance. We did consider requiring zero emissions, but that would have effectively closed down an entire industry.
The pollution controls will be effective in 45 days to 6 months. Meantime, Train wants new legislative muscle for the EPA.
For the past 5 years, an estimated 600 new chemicals a year have been introduced into U.S. commerce. These chemicals have been sold without any systematic advance assessment of their potential impact on human health. We often do not discover how harmful a compound can be until it has become a commonplace item in our everyday life.
The answer, said Train, is a law to give the EPA power to require testing prior to the sale of new compounds. Jed Duvall, CBS News, Washington.
The Lakers wilt, and that's not Chamberlain, at the Forum and lose their first home game in a while. And if you're hunting for a home in Los Angeles, lots of luck. This and more in 1 minute. Oh, she's such a big mouth. The Lakers should have stood in bed last night, even if they only had to get up to go to the Forum. See, what happened was they ran into an aroused Cleveland Cavaliers basketball team, and they lost their first home game in 15 starts, 123 to 103. All 5 Cavalier starters tallied in double figures. In baseball, National League President Chub Feeney met Tuesday with entertainer Danny Kaye and businessman Lester Smith. They are reported interested in buying the San Francisco Giants and possibly moving the franchise up there to Seattle. Well, checking the weather out, you anti-sunshine and blue skies buffs had another bad day Tuesday, and you're due for another one today. Another nippy but glorious day is coming on apace. The forecast calls for some patchy early morning low clouds, hardly enough to even phase the full moon. I tell you, Bob Ferris went bananas writing this weather forecast, but it's good, Bob. I dig it. I like it. It's otherwise fair today through Thursday with sunny days and cold, clear nights. Highs both days near 70 and nightly lows in the low 40s. It used to be that the lower-income people couldn't afford homes and had to live in tenements. Now it's getting so you can draw a very healthy paycheck and still be left begging for a house to live in. Murray Fromson has that story here in Los Angeles.
Still, for millions of Americans, the idea of owning a dream house has become a mirage. New homes are beyond the means of most potential buyers, as are most older ones. The soaring cost of land and construction is driving builders and buyers further into the suburbs. High interest rates, high prices, lack of consumer confidence may cause the housing industry's worst year since 1946. The shortage of homes is affecting everyone in the market. Bob Washkow is a Los Angeles pharmacist. His wife is expecting their second child next May. They've been house hunting for a year and a half and can't find a suitable one at a price they can afford.
What once was a dream for me, not so many years ago, has suddenly become almost a nightmare. I don't want to appear dramatic about this, but these are the realities of the situation. This home buying is going to gobble up our future, our past and our future.
For sale signs are often deceptive. The average price of a new home nationwide has doubled the past 10 years to about $38,000. Experts say 2/3 of all American families cannot afford that much. Those who can, like Bob and Patty Washkow, are still looking, hoping that an end to the economic slump will spur the construction of more and cheaper homes. Murray Fromson, CBS News, Los Angeles.
Listen, while I was doing that lead-in to this story, we were getting feedback. You folks who live right around Sunset and Gower here, would you please keep your TV sets turned down low? The speakers, the sound. Keep the sound down low because we're getting feedback in here. And it's the guys at the transmitter are complaining. All right, so I'm kidding. It's 8 minutes until 2 o'clock, and that's it. That's the late news from Channel 2. CBS Morning News on this channel at 7 this morning. Hughes Rudd anchoring from New York. Ted Kenworthy has a couple nights off. I'm Charlie Dugdale, wishing you a ripping Wednesday. Good morning.